Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, Planning for the Future, Capital Budgeting for Senior Living Communities. I'm John O'Connor from McKnight, and I'll be your moderator today. As buildings get older, competition increases, and controlling costs becomes center stage, the need for informed capital budgeting has never been greater. Just as important is the need for senior living operators to embrace a more sophisticated approach to capital planning that melds both short and long-term objectives. But where to begin? And how do you make sure the process is accurately supported by data and not just a wish list? You're about to find out. Josh Malbegat, who is the Director of Senior Living for Dude Solutions, is a person many of you may already be familiar with. During the past decade and a half, Josh has worked with more than 500 communities, focusing on operational excellence and raising the profile of operations. In his role at Dude Solutions, Josh drives the strategy for software and service delivery based on the unique needs of communities of all care levels. We're going to hear from Josh in a moment, but first we have a few housekeeping matters to attend to. I'd like to note that today's slides will be available for download. You're encouraged to take notes on them as we roll along. If you think you are having audio problems with this broadcast, please first check the volume control on your machine. We found this is the most common cause of hearing problems on presentations such as these. We also encourage you to keep just one browser window open to cut down on the risk of viewing problems. And we'd like to note that this program is made possible by support from Dude Solutions. Please visit the fine folks there at www.dudesolutions.com. We'll have some time at the end of the session for a few questions, and please feel to pass along any you may have, starting right now, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I'd like to let you know that we're going to have a simple exit survey just before the Q&A. Your participation here will be greatly appreciated. Don't worry, I'll remind you it's coming, but please stick around to take care of that little favor for us. Finally, this session will be archived and available on demand shortly after this live broadcast. You can access it again, or others on your team can experience it for the first time by simply going to the registration page to enter the studio. The URL is www.mcknights.com, October 25 webinar. Well, Josh, I know you have a lot of interesting and important information to pass along to our viewers. Are you ready to get started?
That's great, John. I am. Thank you. Really looking forward to sharing this webinar with everyone here. I'm just going to go straight to the agenda. Basically, what I plan to do is talk a little bit about what we've seen as what I'll call the current reality within senior living in terms of how sites are doing, our communities are doing relative to capital planning, the process that they're going through. This might sound familiar to many of you on the call. Then I want to take a slight step back and talk a little bit about the overall value of a capital plan. As you might be able to tell from the current reality piece that we're going to cover, I want to reiterate the value of a capital plan because there's a lot of opportunity there. I don't find, that many organizations are doing it as in-depth or as holistically as they can. And we'll talk about what the impact of that is. And then I've got a quick self-assessment for you. A couple of questions that you can ask yourself or others in your organization to see where you sit. Some neutral questions to kind of guide you as you see where is it that we currently are ourselves. Then I'll talk a little bit about the ideal state. So what we see being, the perfect world, and we can iterate off of that. Ideal state may not be something we can live in, but it's something that we can strive for, and you can decide which elements would fit for your organization. And then we'll look briefly at an actual capital planning process, and through that, touch on some best practices. And then at the end, as John said, we will get into Q&A. And please do feel free to post your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. So without further ado, the current reality. Kind of where do things sit right now? And I'm drawing this from both conversations that I have with asset managers, facilities managers, C-suite folks, data audits that I do on the roughly 1,100 organizations that we work with, basically pulling out what do we actually see happening. And the biggest point, I think, to take away from everything I'm about to show you is that there's a huge opportunity here. We can all get a lot better and deliver a lot more value to stakeholders by taking a real serious look at capital planning. So, first key thing, I've seen studies where basically under 10% of surveyed communities actually have a 20-year capital plan. Lots of folks do a 1 to 2 year, maybe a 3 or 4 year plan, but very few are going into that 20-year horizon, which can be a problem when you start getting into some of the more expensive and longer life assets. Think roof, HVAC equipment, things like that. I've seen a study that was talking about up to 20% of older communities may not actually be viable from a sustainability perspective due to the funds that are being set aside. You know, when we talk about what we're actually putting aside for CapEx, is that enough? Where are those dollars going to go? When we talk about numbers, you know, that range anywhere from $250 to $350 per unit. For an older property, you might go as high as $600 to $700 per unit. But what's actually in the funds that are being set aside? If we think about some of the larger building-related assets, roof, things like that, not enough funds there. That's all we're doing to cover that off. Lots of organizations actually report an interesting one to me, allocating the dollars and then not spending them. Other things kind of come up, projects get approved but not kind of pushed through. So that's an interesting one there to dig deeper into. And then you've got the folks who are actually approving these projects, these capital expenditures or the requests, being left almost as wish masters who are working with guesses on what's actually needed. And we'll dig a little deeper on that. Overall, I think that the reasons for this opportunity or the reasons for failure there, you've got a lack of time. You know, there's some real challenges on getting enough time to actually put the work into doing a capital plan. Once we have the time, or if we have the time, we don't always have the expertise. Sometimes we're leaving this up to folks in the field, our frontline maintenance people or administrators who are fantastic at their jobs, but may not be able to look at a roof and say how many years left it has or what the replacement cost is. And let me be 100% clear, that is no knock on the skill set that individuals have. I think everyone values the operational nature. It's just some of that expertise for the assessment is what I'm referring to. There can actually be a lack of alignment in terms of what the expectations or kind of desires are. There's an interesting exercise that I like to work on when we're getting into this concept of alignment, which is to look at, get either, if you're a multi-site, the administrator to put together their top 10 priorities for their community, and then have a corporate view of that and see where they align. If you're a single site, have the facilities director or maintenance manager put together their list and have the executive director put together theirs and see where that alignment is and where the discrepancies are. Another one is a lack of historical data. That really kills us when it comes to trying to plan decisions or make kind of accurate fact-based decisions. This is why we revert back to using guesstimates. And, of course, then there's the dollar side, the unfunded reserve piece. So with all of this, I've seen a huge opportunity relative to a great process when it comes to capital planning. And what I am going to be talking about today is not just the idea of let's create a 20-year capital plan and go and live with it. It's the idea of creating a capital plan, yes, that goes out as far as we can, but then also collecting the data required to revise that over time and make more accurate decisions when it comes to looking at more immediate replacements. It's like this two-phase view of what's the long-term plan and what's the actual repair history dictating. So we're going to dig into that. So taking that step back as to what's the value of a capital plan? If so few communities are doing it, is that okay? Well, from my perspective, No. And I think for anyone who's gone through reason number one, a large unexpected expense, probably experienced the hurt of that, trying to come up with the dollars or trying to deal with all of the follow-on kind of emergency activity that happens when something major fails, be that the heating system in winter, cooling system in summer, roof in rainy season, all kinds of things. But by creating an effective capital plan, we can really be prepared in advance for some of these larger capital items. Number two is we need to stay competitive. If we aren't staying up on our capital plan, we aren't keeping ourselves current, we risk becoming outdated. We risk being unable to actually deliver on what we're there for, which is a safe environment for our residents. And that actually connects to reason number three, which is that we're not talking about some manufacturing plant where it's just equipment that is making something. We're actually dealing here with people's homes. And I know in all of the groups that I talk to, this is something that is front and center. Everyone's fully aware of. We're not talking about cold assets here. We're talking about something that actually is someone's home that we're wanting to take care of. So we need to have this plan in place to be able to really plan ahead and be good stewards of the resources that we have. So there's a couple additional reasons. It improves that visibility over what's required. It does help us optimize the financial performance, especially when we start to support the replacement plan with operational data. Lets us plan for the future. Reduces compliance risk. This one, I think sometimes people don't always get that connection, but where you have an unfunded capital plan, typically people are, or a lack of awareness on what the capital plan is, people are delaying work, being faced with emergency, and all of that time pulls away from doing the preventative maintenance, doing the compliance inspections, keeping the community safe, that type of thing. It does improve our efficiency when we can make decisions and actually execute on them. And it does have an impact on resident satisfaction. When we're actually taking care of things in advance, we have better communities. And it creates a sustainable future for us so that we actually know what's happening. So with all that in mind, how do you know where you stand? So I've put together two slides here I'm going to share with you that you can use as a self-assessment. And as John said, we'll be making these slides available for download, so don't worry about jotting anything down or screen capping it. We'll send it out to you, as well as a recording. But the first thing that I like to look at are just some general questions. So, number one, do you even have a complete list of your equipment? Do you know what you've got? And this can be on paper, it can be on Excel. We'll talk more about systems in a little bit, but do you have that list? Because you have to know what you have in order to plan for it. And then, once you've got that list, do you know what the current value of each one of those assets are and what the failure risks are? So how soon might it fail? Is it something that we should start monitoring? Is that something you're tracking? And I'm not just referring to, next year's capital budget. We're talking bigger picture view, which goes to the next bullet here. Is there a plan for when assets should be replaced? How far out does it go? If you're only going 3 years out, you're missing a lot of the opportunity. 5 years, a little bit better. 10 years, starting to capture more of the bigger items. 20 years, you'll have that full picture. And then, how do you make repair versus replace decisions? So for a lot of folks, this doesn't always connect directly to their capital plan when they're thinking about this, when they're thinking about things like a facility condition assessment or a capital needs assessment. The idea of it is kind of a one snapshot. It's a picture in time of what the community is. What I'm really advocating for is layering this operational data in so that you're making repair versus replace decisions based on fact. How much money have we spent on these assets? So the question for you is, do you base those repair versus replace decisions just on the capital plan? Are you doing run to fail, basically waiting until the equipment has to be replaced? Do you base it on gut, or are you basing it on maybe what % of the purchase cost have we spent on repairs? And then finally, do you know what your maintenance backlog or deferred maintenance is? Do you know what you've decided not to do? And this layers into the capital plan because some of those things may be operational. Think paint checks, paint touch-ups, that type of thing. That's going to be operational, but others might be things that if we keep letting them go, they're going to become more significant things that are going to have to be built into the capital plan, exterior work, things like that. So here's a quick checklist for you that you can do. Do you have that inventory? Do you have the inventory of the major building components? Do you have the replacement costs for them? What the condition is? Remaining life, deferred maintenance, repair history with costs. If you're on the yes side of this, that's great. You're probably in pretty good state. If you're on the no side, the good news is there's lots of opportunity because a lot of this is actually not that difficult to get together if you invest the time. So when we talk about taking this into the world of actually doing something with this, what does it look like? Basically, I think of this as kind of having three groups of information. So one, we want to know what historical deficiencies we've had. So what haven't we done that we should have done? And that can come from projects that didn't get approved, department head meetings where you're talking about what things they want to have done, historical maintenance work, all kinds of things. Then you need to know kind of current expenditures. Where are we spending money now? And that's from the perspective of looking at that repair versus replace. How much money are we spending on specific pieces of equipment or building components to maintain them? Because if I have that purchase cost, that's going to help steer me towards what is it I need to replace. And then finally, what are the future requirements? That's that real capital plan where people typically default to, looking at what do I need to replace in the future? When are things coming up? And there's two ways to look at this. I find, and I'm calling these the isolated or integrated approaches. So for most folks, they're starting from this, let's call it isolated view. So they're creating a capital plan. They're looking at it once a year when they're planning their budgets. And the priorities are basically based on perceptions. So I have an Excel sheet, maybe a software tool, a list there that basically says, okay, here's the stuff that we needed to do, and I'm prioritizing based on what I think needs to be done. I'm juggling things. And then maybe we're updating it. A lot of the time when I go into organizations, I find if there was a capital plan, it's sitting on a shelf covered in dust, not really being updated. So that's one option. And that's okay in that it gives me a bit of a plan, but I'm really missing out on the true value here, the true opportunity. So the integrated view, and this is where I'm really kind of advocating for having this dual view of things. You create the capital plan. Same thing, do your capital plan. You have to have that plan in place as to what you're going to spend when things need to be replaced. But then you start to track the operational repairs on a per asset basis. What am I spending? This is not complicated. It can be done lots of different ways, but you're tracking the repair costs. And then when you go to make your decisions on your expenditures, you're basing it on fact. Instead of someone coming and saying, hey, we need to, according to the capital plan, do these 15 things, and CFO or regional director saying, okay, well, you only have money for 10. Which ones? And guessing at which ones. Feel okay with this? Maybe we'll do this one. It's kind of this idea of we're guessing at things. So what we're advocating here is if you've got that repair data history, you can layer that in and then say, okay, I can do 15 or 10 of the 15. Here's the 10 that are costing us the most money now. These are the ones we should focus on. So one view, isolated, gets you the very basic bare minimum. I'm giving that an X because I think that it still ends up with, well, honestly, lousy planning. The other one, this integrated view, again, gives us this holistic view, gives us true planning capabilities, giving it a check mark. That's where you want to end up when we talk about the ideal state. Just another way to look at it, for people who like diagrams, think of your capital plan and your your capital plan and your operational data as being isolated, separate. They live in two separate realms. Half the time, the operational data might live in someone's head. With that, you end up with wish lists. And it's kind of like Santa Claus saying, have you been naughty or nice? What are we going to give you this year? Where we want to go to, again, this idea of take my capital plan, layer the operational data in, and drive all that into a solid plan that actually says what I have coming up. You can pull this different ways. Of course, with the Works Hub and Dude Solutions, we've designed software specifically for this. You can use Excel, so there's lots of different options. But here's just a couple samples of what that can look like. So a long-term plan here, you can have different views of it. You want to get to this point where you're able to see on a per-year basis what that capital plan looks like. If I'm a single site, I would be looking at just my operation. If I'm multi-site, I want to be able to drill this in to look at across the whole organization. What are the requirements? Break it down by region, break it down by specific site as I'm planning those budgets. So here I'm doing one that's basically by category, so I can see my HVAC expense line. I like to then look at those by asset categories to further drill it down so that I can get into some tangible pieces of, well, okay, how much am I spending on air handling units? How many units do I have to look at? So pulling me in. And then also being able to look at it from that truly 1 year out view. What are the specific assets that I have to look at? So a view by asset of what needs to be replaced. So this gives me that 1 year view, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 year, 20 year, as far as you want to go. But what I'm looking at in this ideal state is I'm starting out by looking at what that capital plan requirement is multiple years out, drilling into the local year, 1, 2 years, and then layering this idea of the short-term prioritization in. So being able to look at how much am I spending as a percentage of the purchase cost on assets. That then guides the decision making. So instead of it being someone with a wish list, I'm looking at where are we actually spending our dollars? Now, as we get into this, you'll want to decide what thresholds you pick. I'm not advocating for trying to track, every repair to every, exhaust fan or something like that. You pick thresholds that are reasonable so that this becomes something that you can actually really execute on. So when we get into an actual process, so if you agree with the idea of, okay, there's an opportunity on the capital plan, I want to be tracking both of these types of things, how do you execute? So I'm going to walk you through kind of some of the best practices that I've seen, different options. There's lots of opportunity. So talked about this before. What do we need to know? Those historical deficiencies, current expenditures, future requirements. That's what we're driving for. So first off, you want to look at, honestly, in your organization, who's going to do the work? When we're talking about this, it's really assigning someone that's going to be responsible for this. You can choose internal resources or external, but we want to have someone who's responsible for this. This process does not work if it's something that we simply assign out and have 15 people who are throwing things in there. Lots of people can give feedback. We want that, in fact, but you need to have one person responsible for it. And they can have people below them if you're a multi-site rolling up regions and sites, but there has to be one person that's going to take responsibility for this. And it has to be part of their core job function. I've worked with lots of groups where capital planning is tossed in as a, hey, do this amongst everything else. It falls to the bottom of the list. Then you need to figure out, so once you've got your person responsible, you need to figure out to what level you'll collect information. Think of this as your dollar threshold. What's your capital level, your capital threshold? And then you want to look at, what are you going to do with all the info you get? You're going to put it into paper, Excel, software specific to this job? There's pluses and minuses, and I'll touch on some of those, but the idea here is we want to know where we're going to put it. And then you've got, how often are you going to update it? And it's not a question of will you update it, it's how often. you have to review it. Once you get the big work done, it's not something that takes a week to do to review it. It can be a much quicker job, but you have to set that time aside on a set frequency. So when you think about who does the work, you've really got two options here. You can self-service it, or you can do expert help. And think getting consulting firms that do facility condition assessments, and there's different levels within that. Self-service, really nice that it's low cost because you use resources you already have. Downfall is it is a higher effort. You have to have the time for it, that time investment piece. And sometimes you're missing the expertise. You're the expert, and you've got historical knowledge. Your folks will know these buildings as long as you haven't had big turnover. That's a different issue, though. On the expert help side, it is going to cost more, but it's going to be lower effort because you're outsourcing the job. Don't think it's no effort, though. Even if you hire an expert to do a capital plan, you have to tell them where things are. You've got to tour them, be an escort, things like that. It generally is going to be faster because they don't have other distractions like, taking care of resident and staff requests or doing the compliance work orders. They certainly have the expertise, and they generally won't have historical knowledge unless you've had a system to track it. So I put these check marks in purely so if you get a copy of the slides, you can kind of think about these things on your end. Again, I'm not advocating for either one of these. I'm saying you have to pick who's going to do this if you want to be effective on your capital plan and hold responsibility there. Now, system of record. Again, three options. You can take your capital planning data as you collect it, put it into paper. I really don't advocate for that because it's static then. You can do Excel, which is an okay interim step because you've got an ability then to run reports on it and manipulate the information. You can also use software. Of course, that's what I do, so I do have a preference towards it because I find you can do a lot more things, be very flexible, and streamline the communication. But you've got a cost side. So when you're doing this, when you're thinking about the kind of paper logs piece, you will have your basics. You've got the base plans. It is going to be static because we can't update it. Unfortunately, it's really tough to integrate those pieces. We won't have that connected to everything because it's going to be just a paper book. Excel, it'll have the base plan details, no problem. It is dynamic in that you can add tabs, you can track more info. A little cumbersome, but you can do it. So you can start to log information, you can update it. One note on that is if you do want to integrate it with repair expense, you will have to kind of keep separate sheets and connect it. So if you've got a whiz with Excel, this can work. If it's someone who's not as great, you're probably still going to have a base plan that you can update, but it won't be connected to repair histories because that's pretty tough. On the software side, and version control with Excel, you can have difficulties if you have multiple people editing it, knowing who did what. You want to be careful there. So software, you can get your base plan details. Of course, it's dynamic. It can be integrated with the work history, and it's got kind of version control, so you can watch it. Again, paper in a pinch, if that's all you can get, okay. At least you've got a plan. Excel can work well. Just make sure you've got some skills there. And then software, it's going to integrate everything. So again, I added check marks to these for your reference so that you can look at this and see kind of where you might want to think in your organization about, are we okay with the X's where the X's lie? I probably should have put one on the software side that has a cost because there is a cost there, but you can maybe pencil that in. So once we've got our system, then we want to think about key steps here. How do we actually do this? So we want to get out there and collect, inspect, and assess. We need to look at the assets and the building components, identify a condition, replacement cost, and remaining life. Something is better than nothing here. We don't want to kind of kill ourselves pulling everything together. If you outsource it, really easy. They'll have expertise to do all of these things. But this is where it's important to set your threshold. What are you going to look at? Is it assets over 3, 4, 5,000? How detailed do you want to get? And make sure as you're doing this, you're including other departments. If you give this just to, let's say, the maintenance team, make sure that they're grabbing information from nursing on what their expectations are. Some of the equipment that they have from a bed perspective, lifts, it's expensive. If it's just maintenance, they may not think about those things. You need to get the dietary person in for some of the kitchen equipment. Maybe activities or therapy, depending on what type of community you're running. But you want to make sure that your one person that's going to take responsibility for it is getting input on what to include here. Then you've got assembling the information. So if you've got it in your Excel sheet, you want to prioritize and consolidate the data. If you're using software, it kind of takes care of it for you. Paper, you're basically probably using Excel to create that and then printing it off these days. And then you want to maintain it. And this, again, is this point of you've got to track the repairs and keep a log of the costs and the work. And not just costs, but employee time, too, because there's a cost to that. And keep that log of what you've spent on the assets to feed in to those replacement pieces. Then you've got just some key lessons that we've seen over the years. Sorry, I think I hit the wrong button there. Give me a second. There we go. Internal, external, you've got to have someone responsible. You can't just leave it up to a team. It'll die a slow death. You want to take an interdepartmental approach. So you want to involve department heads. I was saying this before. If you just leave it with one department, they're going to miss things. You need to do that exercise of aligning priorities. When it comes time to tough decisions, if you've got that history of repairs, that can help feed in. But there is also the reality view of what does it take to be competitive. Sometimes that'll trump the repair history side, or what needs do we have on the resident side, the care side. So you want to kind of align those priorities, view those pieces, and then you want to review it annually at a high level. I used to say every 2 years. What I found was that if I said 2 years, people didn't actually do it every 2 years. They would say they would, but it wouldn't become part of the routine and it would be forgotten. Doing it annually as part of your capital, your budget planning for the next year process creates a habit and makes it something that you actually follow through on. Kind of like I was at the dentist and we were talking about flossing. Flossing, they actually say that you're fine if you do it every 2-3 days, but they tell us to do it every day because that builds the habit. Build the habit here. So once we have the data, this again is where we get into this idea of actually using it. So this is my number one takeaway from this, is combining capital planning with repair history. If you don't combine these together, you're in that isolated view that I was talking about before. So you've got, for each item on your list, you've got what it is, the cost. You're prioritizing based on perception there. You've got that idea. Then you run the asset history. You'll look at what have we spent, the historical repair cost versus the replacement cost. Let's call that the lemon factor. What's my percentage? Generally, you set yourself a threshold, 15, 20, 25%, and then you use that to prioritize replacements in conjunction with those perceptions. And it's not just the forecasted date. Just because something is forecasted for this year, if I spent 30% of the purchase cost this year, or sorry, if it's forecasted for next year and I spent the money this year, should I replace it now? Should I adapt the plan? So when you're thinking about this, keep in mind that it can result in early replacement or late replacement because your plan should adapt to reality. You might find that, hey, we just spent a bunch of money. We've overhauled this piece of equipment. We're going to defer the replacement for brand new. We can wait another 5-6 years, even though it was next year. Or, okay, manufacturer said it was going to be 8 years. That's what we thought 3 years ago. But, geez, our repair costs and time and downtime is really spiking. We need to bump that up. So it's going to be something that is a living plan that evolves with time. And I know that, a lot of the time this can seem daunting, to try to grab what's my plan, what's the repair history. It doesn't really have to be if you put someone responsible for it and you build a system around doing those annual checks and collecting the repair history info. If you don't put that in place and start to get control over it, you end up kind of being a rudderless ship. There's no real direction in the long term for the capital replacements, and it can be very difficult to be forward-looking and be competitive down the road. So from kind of my presentation piece, that runs kind of the portion that I wanted to cover. I'd like to, John, pass it back to you. I think we've got a short survey we wanted to put up and questions.
Great. Well, thanks, Josh. That was really just a great presentation, and some of those slides are extremely valuable. Actually, they're all valuable. Some, I think, can actually be used tomorrow by a lot of the people watching. As you mentioned, some of our readers have questions. We'll get to them in a moment. But first, before we do that, we'd like to invite everyone to answer a few questions on this survey. As I mentioned, it will just take a moment, and it should be getting pushed to you right about now. And while our audience responds to that, I'd like to get started on some of the questions, if you don't mind, Josh. One viewer asks, what is the most common mistake you see among senior living operators when it comes to preparing a capital budget plan?
So I think most common mistakes, errors, number one is not doing it. But after that, I think it's really looking at it with blinders on, putting one person in charge of it and not getting multiple department views. So looking at the idea of what is it that clinical or nursing teams need, what is it the facilities team needs, and not focusing on everyone's view and bringing that together. I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah, it sure is. And this is a bit of a convoluted question, but it's an important one from one of our viewers. How do you add risk of certain equipment to affect patient safety in addition to cost? For example, if a piece of equipment fails and can affect patient safety versus a piece of equipment that presents less risk to safety?
So I think that is a key concept, and that involves risk assessment. So looking at equipment not just from a dollar-based repair cycle, but planning things also around the risk level associated with this asset. So we've done work with organizations to actually be able to do risk assessments on assets and systems to define what's the consequence of this going down, and what's that follow-on effect. So it's basically the question is, how do you add risk in? Well, you consider risk when you're looking at this. So you evaluate risk as a component of the replacement time. A lot of the times, you're not going to do that during the long-term plan because you'll assume that it's going to last out its life. That will be where you'll start to layer it in more in the shorter-term time horizon. So when I look 1-2 years out, I'm looking at both failure cost and number of failures for those riskier assets, some of the generator, nursing systems, things like that.
Sure, absolutely. Very good. And another viewer asks, how many years of repair data do you need to help you put together your assessment?
How many do you have is always the question. And I say that half in jest. A lot of the time when we start looking at this, people don't have any history. 1 year's history is better than no history. Perfect world, you want 2 or 3 years, but I'll take what I can get. You can make decisions based off of as little of a year's history because you start to see where your chronic problems are, and it gets better every year.
Indeed. And another viewer says that he agrees that doing this in-house always gets a low priority, and asks if you could answer what is the typical cost for an outside firm doing this based on SF or resident units or number of assessments to review.
Yeah, so that's a tough one. It's really based off of square footage, size of building, single building, campus. best bet there is if someone can, if that person would drop me an email, I can get them a couple of questions that they can answer to get them a more accurate number. I hate to just throw something out and have someone quote me, out of context on a number that doesn't fit, either too high or too low.
Right. As is the case with so many other things, it depends.
Yeah.
So this is a question that you may not be the person to answer, but given the unusual name of your company, a person asks, why Dude Solutions?
Yes. Well, so short backstory on it. Original company that was out there that created the Works Hub was Windmill Software. In 2014, we were acquired by Dude Solutions. We were working in the same space, and they decided to really commit resources to the senior living market, so bought myself and my team. We were for sale, I guess.
Sure.
To really help build out the senior living side of the business. And I asked the exact same question when we were in our due diligence period. Scratch my head and say, so what's this name? And the explanation I got from the CEO, Kent Hudson, was they were looking for a name back in 1999 when they started that would perk people's ears up. They were selling into schools at the time, would put a smile on a receptionist's face when they called in, saying where they were from, would be a, what do you do? But more kind of emblematic of the feeling they wanted to have is that representing that person in the organization who was a go-to, male, female, the person who you could go to who could fix your problem. That was what they wanted to be, and hence the Dude.
Very good. As the saying goes, now we know the rest of the story. So another great question. How do you determine the additional life to an asset when performing a substantial repair?
Well, so that's a determination where you look at what have you replaced and what is the kind of revision to the life. The way I would approach it, quite honestly, is if I'm having a contractor come in to do an overhaul on a unit, I would ask them what their historical experience has been. If they're doing this work for me, and usually you can do this because we're not doing a lot of this work internally, we're getting into contractors coming in, you can get data from them on what their historical experience has been like and include them in that evaluation of should we be doing this overhaul or replacing it, because that factors in how much is it and what extra life am I going to be getting from it.
Indeed. Another great question here. Can you elaborate on the difference between a systems level assessment and an assessment focusing on individual units?
We've got people getting into the detail there. That's great.
Get in the weeds here.
So, no, but it's an important distinction, I think. So it's a great question because a lot of the times I see very high-level system-level assessments that are done where essentially someone does a view of the building looking at, okay, your HVAC system. Here's what it's going to be, model it. You'll have to spend $15,000 this year, $100,000 this year, but they don't get into the detail of the specific items within it. That high system level can work for you when you're just trying to model something. If I was acquiring a building, I might do something like that as a quick and dirty way to get an idea of what's this going to run for me. But if I'm operating a building, I want to get down to the asset level because then I can actually make that repair versus replace decision based on historical data. I can't look at a piece of equipment when it's at the system level because everything's batched together. When I individualize it, I can actually do the maintenance operations tracking and use that from an operations perspective. I hope that gives that person clarity there.
Indeed. And another down and dirty question, is there a rule of thumb such that repair replace is, say, 10 or 20% or 30% of the maintenance budget?
So this one for me, I know everyone always looks for that magic number. It's tough to give because of the previous question we had about if I overhaul a unit, how do I assume or how do I estimate the revised remaining life? When we overhaul equipment, we might say, hey, we just spent 50%. So if we say, hey, every time it's 30%, we want to replace it, well, we're not factoring in where we've done these overhauls to extend the life. So the rule of thumb that I use is this. If I see something trending over 15%, I want to look deeper at it. It's not an automatic replacement, but it's a what's going on here. As well, I might dig deeper into it and look going back over a period of time. Is that 15% something that was one repair, or is it something that has been 15 different problems? And then I want to look at this not just from the cost, but the inconvenience perspective of what's happening with that asset failing that regularly.
So 15% is sort of the yellow light. You're not really quite sure if you should stop or go, but it kind of depends.
Exactly.
Okay, very good. And in your opinion, which capital asset can cause the most damage if it is not properly cared for?
So, I mean, biggest item that if we don't at least plan for and deal with, your roof. If your roof fails, water penetration, we're talking, damage through the entire building potentially, the follow-on damage to assets that get impacted by water, the inconvenience to residents when we have to move them out. That to me is one of the biggest ones from a building kind of system perspective. Then you get into assets, and I think here safety-wise, for me, generators. That we're not watching for. They don't run on a regular basis beyond the tests. If we're not watching and replacing them, they won't be there for us in the emergency when we really need them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially after what we saw happen, in last year when the hurricanes hit Florida and generators were either not working or non-existent, and it was not a pretty picture, unfortunately. As an executive director, which department heads should my this is another question, excuse me. As an executive director, which department heads should my point people be when it comes to capital budgeting?
So, from my perspective, I do see facilities being the point of the spear, if you will, because they have the widest connection to the capital assets themselves. They are the ones that are taking care of them. They work with them. So they are, to me, the lead person. And where that fails is in organizations where you may not have a true management person in that role. If you have more of a working supervisor, I would modify that and say in those cases it's probably going to be the administrator that has to take that lead role on that piece. And then I see them being supported by the clinical side, the dietary side, the marketing folks, and the activity or therapy people.
From my experience, I think that's a great list. Another great question here. Could you argue improved efficiency of today's equipment should be factored stronger in useful life assessments? Newer devices are more electrical than mechanical in many ways, however.
Yeah, it's that old thing that they don't build it like they used to. So you could argue that. However, I just had to take my dryer apart and fix it because the belt tensioner blew apart, and the thing was only a year and a half old. The dryer before ran for 17 years, I think, with no problems. Not talking about energy efficiency, but I don't know. I'm hard-pressed to say that would be true.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Well, it looks like we have time for maybe another question or two. And here's one. We just purchased a community from a mom-and-pop operator who kept minimal records at best. Where do I get started?
Inventory of assets. Do that assessment. If you purchased it, you may have had a basic capital needs assessment done that'll tell you where your red flag areas are. Focus on those. If you purchased it just with your own site inspection, it doesn't happen so much anymore, but if that happened, I would look at getting the inventory and then interviewing the department heads to find out where their hot button issues are.
Very good. And finally, if there's one takeaway from today's presentation you'd like everyone to remember, what is it?
Capital planning is not an isolated event. You've got to combine it with repair history to stop the guesswork and iterate.
Very good. Well, thank you, Josh. That was a great presentation, and we really appreciate all the information and insight you shared with us today. Fantastic job.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity.
Sure, of course. Well, folks, we hope you've enjoyed today's webcast. This session will be available shortly at www.mcknights.com/October25webinar. We'd like to, of course, give our special thanks to Josh for some real insight on upping your capital budgeting game. We'd also like to thank our session sponsor, Dude Solutions. You can check them out on the web at www.dudesolutions.com. And finally, we'd also like to thank you, our listeners, for attending this important event. For McKnight, this is John O'Connor, wishing you a good day.